This episode is all about how to avoid having to work unnecessary long hours as a tax professional that you don't want to work without compromising your career progression. You're listening to episode 75 of the Tax Professionals podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop and improve their careers. Strap yourselves in, as this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and you're definitely going to hear me have a rant or two in this one.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. A few months back, I'm on the morning train heading into the office, and as I often do, I'm catching up on the tax news. I come across one article that almost immediately annoys me. The article touches upon working long hours, working in tax, and as this is a sensitive topic to me, I'm in no mindset to be entirely objective whilst reading this. The article seems to give a view that if you want to work in tax, then you need to accept that you have to work long hours. This is a view that I completely disagree with, and a mindset that I think is detrimental to the profession. Tax is already a profession that has a talent shortage. People perceive tax as boring. Why would someone want to work in a boring area and have to work long hours? I get off the train and start walking to the office, still thinking about this article, and I knew I was going to have to cover this topic on the podcast. I know many who work in tax who work long hours, and there are certainly times for some tax areas where long hours are harder to avoid, like tax return season for personal tax specialists. But it certainly doesn't have to be like that, and it doesn't have to be the norm. Throughout my whole career, I've rarely worked long hours, completely out of choice, and it hasn't negatively affected my progression. My values around work have always been to work hard, produce work of high quality, and be efficient and productive. Work is part of my life and not the only part of it. Yes, there are times when I work over my core hours. In fact, I regularly work 1 or 2 more hours a week. Completely out of my own choice though, and not out of necessity. Usually, I will choose to work over because I like what I'm doing, I'm learning something new, or it's helped me to get better at something. And yes, there have also been times where I've worked more hours than I wanted to because I felt it was necessary to do a good job. And yes, there have also been times where I've worked more hours than I wanted to because I felt it was necessary and I wanted to do a good job, not because I wanted to work the long hours. But that has honestly been probably no more than 5 times, and I've now been working in tax for almost 8 years, currently as a senior manager. Many people talk about wanting a work-life balance, or a better balance than they currently have, and so in this episode I want to share my advice in terms of how I avoid working unnecessary long hours so that you can do the same. I just think it's not healthy for the profession to have working long hours as the norm. So just to be clear, this episode is not about how to never work long hours, or how to only work your core hours. It's about you working no more hours than you want to, except in some rare, unavoidable cases. For rough timings for each of the sections within this episode, head on over to the details section within the episode within your podcast player of choice, or head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP75. I'm a believer that we are responsible for our own tax career, progression and development, but that we should have the resources available to us to do this. I look for gaps in these resources so that I can fill these gaps. And I'm currently working on my next masterclass for tax professionals, the Tax Advice Masterclass, which is being designed to teach you and other tax professionals how to provide commercial, valuable and actionable tax advice that clients actually want, turning you into a desirable advisor. By the time this episode is released, you should probably be able to enroll. I'll put a link into the episode show notes as soon as that's possible, and I'm going to be delivering the first Tax Advice Masterclass in July of this year, for those of you who are interested. If like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James from the tax recruitment company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James could help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP75, or you can book a chat with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's currently recruiting for many roles in this area. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Tip 1 is to be upfront and honest about whether a deadline is achievable at the point the deadline is suggested. So when I was at my first tax job, I was about 6 months or so into the role, and I remember this one day when the partner walks into the office and they ask me to do some research that they need doing urgently, and as soon as they asked me to do this piece of research, I'm thinking, this research is going to take me quite a long time to do. I also have a lot of other deadlines, and it's just not going to be realistic to do all of them and do a good job of all of them. And so I say to the partner that I can do this piece of research for them. It's probably going to take me about 2 days worth of time to do it, and that I would need to push back some of the other deadlines for some of the other work that I'm working on, and would they be okay with this? And they turned around to my surprise and just said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. I just told them that I need about 2 days to do this piece of research, and I thought they're going to turn and go, why on earth do you need that long? But they don't do that. They just agree to it, allow me to move the other deadlines back and do this piece of work. And so I do this piece of work, give them the output of it, and the next day, or maybe 2 days later, the partner walks in with a printout of the output from the research that I've done. And they just say to me that this is really good, and they seem surprised, but they just said this is a really good piece of work. So I would not have been able to do a good job on that piece of work if I hadn't been upfront and honest about the fact that it was going to take me a long time to do, and that it was clashing with other deadlines because I'd been under too much pressure. And also, even if I did try and do all of them by the deadlines that were there, then I'd have had to work longer hours, more than my core hours, which I just didn't want to do. And so in this case, it was like a complete win-win because I didn't have to work longer hours than what I wanted to work, and the piece of work was also good. And that was all achieved by just being upfront and honest about the deadline as soon as I got asked to do a piece of work. So at the point that someone asks you to do something, whether it's a client or it's a colleague, just think straight away, is it realistic to do this with all the other work that you've got on? And when you're thinking about this, always overestimate how long you think a task is going to take you, because naturally as humans, we're always going to think that something is not going to take us as long as what it actually ends up doing. And you might not be able to answer this straight away. You might not know straight away. So you can always say to someone, just give me like 5-10 minutes. I'm just going to go and have a look at the other work I've got on, and then I can come back to you on this and let you know whether that's realistic and achievable. So then you can go away, think about it, come back to them. And if you think it's not achievable, then you don't want to just go in there and go, oh no, I can't start by that deadline, because a client or a delegator, that's just not helpful to them, and they're probably going to be a bit annoyed by it. So you should try and help them to solve that problem that you've now almost created for them by not having the capacity to do that work without having to work longer hours, which you're trying to avoid doing. So, an option could look like that you can do it, but it means you can do this piece of work by the deadline, but it means that another piece of work is going to get pushed back and it'll be later than the deadline that's previously been agreed. They might be okay with that. It could be that that another colleague has got more capacity to do this piece of work in the deadline, or one of the pieces of work that you can't do both of by a deadline. Could you move the deadline with the client? Could you suggest that to the delegator? Because if you can move that piece of work or a piece of work, then that will take the pressure off and mean that you don't have to work longer hours. The thing is with longer hours anyway, is I always think that if you end up working more hours, like once you get past like that 7 hours point, every minute you do, the quality of your work is less, or it takes you longer to do it. And it's just, for me, not a good way to work. So which is why I always try and make sure that I can do the work within like a reasonable amount of hours. So as I say anyway, you don't have to just do this internally. It can apply to clients too, but always just be realistic with deadlines. And if something becomes not achievable for whatever reason, let's say you've agreed Friday, but then you realise that it's going to be Tuesday when you're going to be able to finish it by, communicate it as soon as you realise that. Because as a person who delegates to people, if someone comes to me like a week before a deadline and goes, oh, I'm really sorry, I've overestimated how much work I'd underestimated how much work I got, I'm not going to be able to do everything, is it possible to move this deadline to this date? Then in almost every case, I'll be like, yeah, that's absolutely fine, because then I can manage the client's expectation. I can maybe find other people to help out on the work, whatever it is. I can do something if I'm communicated with up front. Like leaving it until like an hour before the deadline is usually not a good way to do it, but it's obviously better than letting the deadline pass before saying anything at all. But just wherever you're doing something and suddenly you've realised that you don't have enough time, be upfront and communicate it as soon as you realise that you can't do something by a time that's being promised. But obviously, if you're doing the being upfront and thinking about that right at the start, you're going to avoid this being a circumstance anyway. But obviously, as we know, it's not possible to avoid certain things entirely. So if you get in that situation where you've already thought about it up front, but then realise that a deadline's unrealistic, communicate it straight away. So the tip number 1 then is all about being upfront and honest, whether a deadline is achievable at the point it is being suggested. Tip number 2, make your boundaries clear from day one of your job. Now, I know a lot of you are going to be in a position where you've already been working in your role for a while, and so you're not going to be at day one, but do it as early as possible if you can't do it from day one. So, making your boundaries clear is about, for example, telling people when you're going to leave in advance, which is obviously easier to do if you have a reason to leave for something. Let's say you've got to pick your kids up from school, or you've got a family gathering that you've got to go to, whatever it is. It's easier when you do that, but you don't need to have a reason to leave early. You can just tell people that, I'm catching the train at 5:15 today, just so you know. So if you need me, make sure you ask me to do something before 4:00, because that'll give me enough time to fit it in. If you're in like a meeting or on a call or something, or you're waiting to speak to someone, then you can make it clear to them that it's getting to the end of the day. Because what happens a lot of the time in meetings and calls, to be honest, is you talk about a lot of things that are irrelevant to the objective that you're trying to achieve. And so by just keeping an eye on the clock, communicating that time's getting on, it's getting close to the end of the day, you're going to focus the minds of the people in that meeting to then think, okay, we've got to stop wasting time here and focus on the key points to get this completed. Just last week, actually, I had a team member that was going on holiday, and they were handing over some work for me to oversee whilst they were off. And the meeting was scheduled at 11 initially. About an hour before that, they asked me if they could move it because they had another piece of work that they needed to finish as a priority, which I was absolutely fine with. And so I looked in their calendar. They were free at 3 p.m, so I moved the meeting to them. As soon as I did that, they just let me know that they've got another meeting beforehand and it might overrun. But it got to 4:15 and we still hadn't spoken yet. And this was on a Friday as well, so I wanted to leave fairly promptish because I wanted to enjoy the evening, I suppose. And so I just messaged them over Teams and just said something along the lines of when is it that you want to speak? I'm just getting cautious of the time. And that was me essentially telling them that you haven't got long to speak to me if you want to speak to me to hand over this work for me to oversee. I suppose in essence I am doing them a bit of a favour by doing this because I'm looking after their work for them. Obviously I want to help them anyway, but you've got to kind of remember sometimes that when you're doing things for other people, there is something in it for them. And so they almost need to be reasonable with you and act within fairness, I suppose. But one thing that I've definitely done over the years is I've not created the expectation that I will be there past 5:15. And will I work past that time? Yes, in emergencies and if I want to, I suppose, but I definitely don't make it the norm. People know that 5:15, that is me essentially done for the day. And if I am doing stuff, usually I'll make myself as uncontactable as possible after that because I just want to get my head down and finish off whatever it is that I'm doing. As well with your boundaries, I would always take your lunch break. I often reject meetings that are put in over lunch when I've got meetings either side of it because one, I don't think it's healthy to just work straight through lunch. I end up being really unproductive around the rest of the day. And I just think if you let that expectation happen where people can just take over your time, whether it's within the working day or outside of it, then you're not helping with setting your boundaries and making them clear to people. So whether it's the time you start, the time you leave, or taking your dedicated lunch break, whatever it is, make your boundaries clear from day one and follow through. If you want to leave at a certain time and you tell people you're doing that, stick to it. Don't be like, I'm leaving at 5:15, and then suddenly at 7:30 you're still working because someone's asked you to do something last minute. So tip number 2 is all about making your boundaries clear from as early as possible, ideally from day one. Tip 3, purge all your pointless, non-essential and non-important tasks. So there was a point where I was rewriting my to-do list every single day, and it was half a page of A4 plus another half a page of A4 of tasks that had been on there for ages, weeks and in some cases months. Now looking back, a lot of those tasks were just kind of pointless. Like there was no benefit of doing them, even though I might have been asked to do it by someone else. Like in reality, there was not a large benefit from doing those tasks. They were non-essential and they were certainly non-urgent. Probably about 4 years ago now, I read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People for the first time, which is a great book for those of you who haven't read it. But within that book, there's like a table with 4 sections in it. Because it breaks tasks down into tasks that are important, ones that are not important, ones that are urgent, and ones that aren't urgent. And so you've got one kind of quarter of this table for each of those. You have a quarter for the important tasks and the urgent ones, one's for the important, non-urgent ones, one's for the non-important, urgent ones, and one for the non-important, non-urgent tasks. So those are the 4 different boxes. And any that are in the boxes that are not important, you want to get rid of those straight away, or at least reduce as much of them as you can. Obviously, if a partner, for example, has asked you to do something, you can't just be like, well, I'm not doing that. You could instead talk to them and just say, I've got all these things on there. It's going to take me ages to get to this task. Is it really necessary? Or could I do something else instead? Or could someone else pick it up? Whatever it is, purge your to-do list of all those pointless tasks so you get something more manageable and that you're only working on stuff that actually is of value anyway. And similarly, actually, there's another book I read, this one probably about 2 years ago now. It's called The One Thing. And that book has this concept of blocking out time for the most important tasks, and usually ones that aren't urgent as well, because it's very easy for us to spend time on important urgent tasks. But if you just spend time on important urgent tasks, you end up putting out fires literally all the time. And the more time that you can spend in that box of important, non-urgent, the less time you will need to spend in that important, urgent box, because you've set up things to stop things becoming urgent, because you get ahead or you deal with them before they become urgent type thing. But those 2 books talk about the concept in a different way, but essentially the same thing. Focus your time on the important urgent and the important non-urgent tasks and get rid of everything else. So just in terms of some examples then of tasks that are important but not urgent, and doing these things might feel like a bit of a waste of time at first when there's more urgent tasks to do, but from my experience, spending time on these important non-urgent tasks will save you time in the long run and mean that you spend less time reacting to people and allow you to be more proactive and focus on the things of importance that aren't necessarily urgent. But some examples of these important and non-urgent tasks are like training for yourself or maybe team members. It could be improving a process to make it much more efficient, or getting rid of a process that doesn't serve a purpose anymore. There's no point having processes for process sake. Could you create templates, because then you can use them going forward to save having to reinvent the wheel from scratch every single time? Could that save you time? Setting good objectives for you and your team, because if you have good objectives, then you will focus on those important non-urgent areas to get ahead and not have to just be stuck in that important urgent tasks box. And forward planning. So I actually spend an hour every single week on a Friday thinking about the next week, thinking about the work that I've got in terms of things that are important and urgent because there's a deadline coming up, and also those things that are important but are not urgent, because I always want to spend some time every single week working on non-urgent but important tasks to keep shrinking that box of being in the important urgent area and spending more time in that important and non-urgent area, because it's where you get that breathing space, where you get time to think properly and kind of be more strategic and plan and get ahead of things. So obviously, in order to spend time in the important and urgent box and the important non-urgent box, you need to have an understanding and a sense of what is important and what the priorities are, both for you personally, your wider team, and the whole organisation. Because once you have an understanding of that, then you can make sure that you spend that time in those areas. Because if you don't understand what's important, then you could be spending time on something or a lot of ages on something to find out that actually it was a pointless task. You don't want that. You want to get rid of them straight away. So one example this year where I'm spending time in something that's important and non-urgent is for one product that we're developing in our team this year. So that is like, this product that we're creating is where we think most of our fees for the team are going to come from this year. And so I've had a choice between spending time on that, which is like an investment of time because it's going to pay off hopefully later in the year, versus me spending time now on lots of small business development opportunities, trying to win small pieces of work. I've had a choice between doing those two things. And so where I've been able to help on this product, developing it and starting to talk to clients about it, I've done that first because that's an important task, but it's not urgent right now because the product's not completely done. We're waiting for software to be developed and all these things, but we're getting ahead. So for me, I'm spending time on something that's important, non-urgent, but when it comes to later on in the year, it's going to really help us to generate a lot of fees with of course, the thought that everything's going to go as planned. So tip 3 is purge all pointless, non-essential and non-important tasks from your to-do list and focus only on those things that are important. So that's whether they're urgent or non-urgent, and aim to spend time every single week on tasks that are important and non-urgent, because you will then shrink that time that you spend reacting and putting out fires. And of course, the thing is, when you're putting out fires and reacting to things, is someone could come to you like an hour before you want to finish and be like, this needs doing, and then you feel like you've got to, or you might even have to do it in some circumstances. So then you're going to end up working more hours than what you wanted to do. Whereas obviously the whole point of this episode and all the advice with it is for that not to happen. Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or to discuss available tax roles, get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. His contact details can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP75, or you can book a call with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. Also, if you're interested in any of my masterclasses for tax professionals, then you can head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. And the next masterclass I'll be delivering is in July of this year, which will be the first tax advice masterclass. And then I'm doing the third tax research masterclass in September of this year. Tip number 4 is schedule time for the important tasks, particularly the ones that are non-urgent. So you can block time out in your calendar and treat it like a meeting. So let's say you wanted to spend time on doing some business development in that week, but it's non-urgent, but is important. Then you could block out an hour, say, on the Tuesday where you want to spend time on it. Make sure that you actually adhere to that block of time. Like, don't put it in there and then just ignore it. And also, during that block of time, make yourself essentially non-contactable in that time. Of course, make yourself contactable for emergencies, but in pretty much all cases, something is not going to be that urgent that they can't wait an hour to speak to you. So in terms of being non-contactable, that means you essentially ignore your phone, you ignore your Teams messages. So I always put myself on Do Not Disturb, which means that if someone does message me, then there's no sound that comes through and it doesn't pop up on my screen. I do put my phone on to silent as well, but it's within view. So if it does ring, I can see that it rings, see who it is, decide whether I think it's going to be urgent or not, and then decide whether I pick up then, or will call them back after my time block, as I like to call it. And also, I've turned off email notifications. So if I get an email, it doesn't pop up on my screen. There's no sound when I get an email, and it doesn't even change. Actually, it doesn't even have that little sign to show you that you've got unread emails. I remove that too, because these are all triggers for me to go and look at my email. And then I would spend time looking at my email, wasting time not responding to it, reading it, having to reread it later. So I just wanted to not spend time doing that anymore. So tip number 4 is all about scheduling time for those important tasks, particularly those that are non-urgent, because the non-urgent ones are the things that you're going to push to one side, but they will reap big rewards when you do spend time on them and complete them. So scheduling time on the important tasks anyway will just make sure that you're not spending time on tasks that aren't important, so essentially wasting time. So then you're more productive and efficient in that day and get things done more quickly and reduce the chances of you having to work longer to get something. This is actually where I think most people make the mistake, because a lot of people waste so much time, whether it's talking to colleagues, whether it's unnecessarily responding to emails that are just not important, whether it's typing messages on Teams, whatever it is, I see people waste so much time here. So if you want to listen to one thing from this episode, definitely take this one away from it. Schedule that time, ignore people in your time block, and stop wasting time on things that are just not important. Tip 5 is don't just think short term. You want to think long term too. If you only think short term, you will only ever focus on those important and urgent tasks. You won't focus on anything else, and you'll just be constantly putting out fires. So, like what I was talking about earlier with that one project that I've been focusing on for business development purposes, I could be spending lots of time now on smaller pieces of work that are likely to be converted right now, but over the course of the full year, it's not going to make a big difference in terms of us meeting our target and whether or not we exceed it or not. So I'm spending all my BD time first on working on this one product, so that because I can see how that will have big payoffs for us later on in the year and make it much more likely that we hit and exceed our billing target as a team. So, in terms of like thinking long term and not always short term, like one case where people think short term more than long term is when it comes to delegating and training staff. How many times have you heard people go, "Oh, it's just quicker to do it myself"? Well, it might be quicker to do it yourself now, but what about in 2 weeks' time once that person knows how to do it and can do a good job of it? Is it going to save you time then? And yes, when it comes to like repetitive tasks, it's more straightforward to teach someone how to do it and then delegate it. But what about where something's not a process or something isn't repetitive? Again, dedicating that time to train and spending that time to delegate in the first place, whilst it might take longer the first few times, if you're thinking long term and about the time it will save you further into the future, that is obviously a way to mean that you don't spend as much time in that urgent, important box and spend more time in that important, non-urgent box instead. So the way to think long term and not short term is to plan ahead. The further you can plan ahead, the future, because this will help you to know like how much work you've got, what capacity you have, whether you've got important tasks that you need to have time on that aren't necessarily urgent, but you need to get done really because it's going to make a big difference. So when it comes to planning ahead, I tend to think around 2 weeks, a week to 2 weeks in advance, depending on like the busyness and the amount of work that I know I've got on. And I've caught myself in this catch-22 sometimes where I've been spending a lot of time on planning like 2 weeks in advance. But then because there's so many variables, so many things that can change, it kind of ends up being a waste of time. And so you don't want to get to that point like what I've been a few times where you're spending so much time on planning and it's not actually saving you time and helping anymore. It's actually being detrimental. There's not like a perfect clear line on when you step over that and when you stay within it. But just be cautious of it, because I had a time where I was probably spending 3 hours on a Monday morning planning work for me and for the team for the week. And it just wasn't saving 3 hours worth of time, and I now probably spend about an hour and a half, and it does save time over the course of the week. Actually, during the start of COVID, in my team we had a lot of this one piece of work, and it was making us really, really busy. And I kept saying to people in the team, like, we can't accept any more work now as a team, and promised it for quicker than 2 weeks' time, to which the team wasn't exactly listening to me. I think because in part they didn't believe me that we wouldn't be able to do it. But then what ended up happening was we'd promise something within 2 weeks. I would then have to call the client to be like, we can't do it within 2 weeks. It's going to be 3, which was not an ideal way to work at all. And obviously the reason I was doing that is because I didn't want anyone, including me in the team, to have to work longer hours than what was necessary. So what I ended up doing was I created what I now call a work scheduler, which is where for the whole team, we put in the work that we know that we've won and work that's likely to be won because the client's essentially given us the go-ahead on it. Estimate how long it's going to take, how much time we need of like people at each level, like whether it's senior manager, whether it's trainee level or manager level. So then we can block out that time and see how much capacity we have available in the team. So before we promise someone a piece of work and before we promise a deadline, we can look in our work scheduler and be like, well, we can't do it this week, we're too busy, haven't got enough capacity, but we have next week or the week after that. So I can highly recommend that you try and implement something similar if you find yourself having too much work because people are over-promising work for clients, etc. Because that work scheduler for me looking at the work we have across the team and capacity, etc., is what enabled me to go to people in the team and go, look, this is how much work we've got for this week. It's not possible for us to take up more work, and I could give them something tangible. Whereas before, when I was just going, we can't promise anything for 2 weeks because we just don't have the capacity to deliver it, they just had to kind of take it on trust at that point, and they probably thought I was over-exaggerating. Whereas obviously, of course, when I've got this like work scheduler sheet, they can then see for real that I'm not messing around when I say we can't do something until X week. We did have something ridiculous at one point. It was like a 2-month waiting list, which we're not there now, to be fair, because we've got more capacity in the team, but we did have a pretty rough period during COVID. So yeah, tip number 5 is to think long term anyway, and not always just short term. Tip 6 is aim to be productive and effective when doing work. So I've already touched upon a way to do this earlier with like blocking out time and avoiding distractions during that time. That will help you to focus and be much more effective with your time in those periods than you would be if you're constantly getting distracted and you didn't block out that time. Where people, including me in the past, wasted a lot of time is with emails and messages. So literally every single time an email would come through, I would open it and look at it. Even if I did nothing with it, I would always look at it as soon as it come in. So that was bad on 2 levels, because one, it took my focus away from the work I was doing. So after I read the email, I would then have to get my brain back into the task I was already doing, which could take a bit of time. When you're flicking back and forth between emails and that work a lot of time gets wasted. And 2, I was having to then reread that email and do something with it later. So it just was not a good use of time at all. So as I've said earlier, like, I don't look at them anymore. I've turned off all notifications in my emails. I put Teams onto Do Not Disturb a lot. So then I'm in control of when I'm distracted, and I can focus for short periods on different pieces of work without being distracted. There's this feeling I think a lot of people have that they have to respond to emails and to messages straight away, particularly if you're more junior and let's say a partner is asking you to do something. I can understand that like feeling to want to respond straight away. But as soon as you start doing that, you're creating that expectation. And then every time someone asks you to do something or sends an email or a message, they're going to expect you to respond straight away. And if you're in a meeting, say, and someone sent you a message, you wouldn't even know you had it. Or even if you did, you wouldn't look at it because you'd be in the meeting. So why does it have to be any different for you blocking out time to spend on more on important tasks, get them done in an effective and productive way? So in order to like build up a bit of resistance and resilience with this, I just suggest that if you get an email and you feel like you need to respond to it straight away, just leave it a little bit and keep leaving it a bit longer than you would feel comfortable leaving it. And so over time, you will like build up how long you can leave it before you start feeling uncomfortable that you haven't responded yet. And when it comes to this is something that I say a lot of people do, and I understand why people do it, but don't apologise for not responding to someone immediately. Like, it's okay to wait an hour or a day or maybe even 2 days before responding to something. Like, we don't need to respond to things straight away, particularly when it's not urgent. Another thing that can help you with being productive and effective is to basically do the right task for your current energy levels. So I know for me, for example, that I'm awful between about 1:30 and 3:30 every single day. It's like where I struggle to concentrate most. I have a foggy mind, like I'm just slow on things. So if I'm doing anything where it requires a lot of thought, it just ends up being a bad use of time. And so what I tend to do in that time instead is use that to respond to messages, talk to people, respond to emails, etc., because I can do those effectively in that time, but I wouldn't be able to say write a detailed report or do some complicated tax research in that time because my brain just isn't in the mode to do that well. Always be thinking when you're doing something, am I like doing this in the quickest way possible? Obviously without cutting corners, of course, and not doing a bad job, making sure you're doing a good job, but is there a way to do it quicker? So, for example, keyboard shortcuts are a good way to do things in a more quicker way rather than keep right-clicking and clicking copy and then paste, which I see particularly people of the older generations do. Could you just do Control-C and Control-V to copy and then paste? That can save time. Could you become quicker at typing if you're a really slow typist and you do a lot of writing at work? Then that could save you time. 2 screens for me have helped massively with saving time because I can have multiple documents open at once and then have, say, a Word document open where I can take notes. Whereas if I had one screen, I wouldn't be able to have them all open at once, and then I'd have to keep finding the one to open, closing it, reopening it, or just unminimizing it, essentially, that takes a lot of time. And as I said earlier in this episode as well, make sure that you take your lunch break, because otherwise you will just be really unproductive. Like if you just work and have no break for your brain, whilst you might be spending an extra hour on work, you're probably outputting less than what you would have done if you'd have just taken that break, because of the negative effect not having your lunch break will have on your productivity. Tip number 7 is to delegate to and get support from your colleagues. And you don't have to be a manager by title to do this per se. You could be, say, a trainee, and there's a brand new trainee that started, and you know that they've got a lot of time to do something. You could pass something over to them. And if you're really struggling to do something because you just don't have enough time to do it by the deadline, could a colleague, maybe same level, more senior, help you so that you can get it done by a certain deadline? If you are delegating anyway, whether it's at manager level or whatever, make sure that you delegate something as far in advance as possible. So ideally at the point that you know you have that work to do, because then you're going to give yourself the best chance of helping that person you're delegating to do a good job. If they don't do a good job first time, then they can have another go, or even if you can't get them to a point where they're doing it well, you can then give yourself enough time to pick it up, because I suppose the worst case situation is that you're no better off by delegating, but you don't want to be worse off, although obviously in some cases, particularly where you're training someone or helping them to get better, it's unavoidable and you need to accept a bit of you need to spend a bit more time doing this in this case, because of the delegation and because of that training element. So when it comes to delegation anyway, I can just try and encourage you to practice and aim to get better at delegating as a skill, because whilst it can be a pain when you first start doing it, and if you're not getting kind of the results that you want from people when you're giving them things to do, in the long run, once you work out how to do it and once you've trained your staff enough, it will save you a lot of time and it will make your job easier. I've been working on my delegation a lot since around assistant manager level, and I've definitely had my fair share of what I want to call disasters, where it's gone wrong, like the work that's been produced it's been nothing like what I need or what I envisaged, and partly it could be down to the person that I've delegated it to not taking enough care and responsibility in doing the work, but also partly down to me not delegating that work well, which I can see now with experience and working on this skill. But with delegation anyway, you can get rid of those easy tasks that you know others can do well anyway, straight away. And then you can keep the ones that only you or only people of a certain grade can do. I have got some delegation episodes actually on the podcast, and I'll put links to them in the show notes. I think there's 2. There might be one guest episode, and then also an episode where I thought I'd cracked delegation, which it turns out that I haven't completely. But it was a bit of a breakthrough moment that did make a big difference for me in delegation, and it's probably going to do the same for you too. Tip 8 is to look for an employer where the hours you want to work are possible. So if you've tried everything else in this episode and whatever else that you've come across as ideas, and you just can't seem to get to the hours that you want to work because it just doesn't seem possible at the place right now, then be ready to look for somewhere where you can work that does allow you to work those hours, because it will be possible to do that somewhere. So some of you will tell me that I'm being unrealistic with the advice that I'm giving in this episode. Maybe you work for a big four, which is where I think it's more likely that you're going to work longer hours. I think it's fair to say that, to be fair, maybe not for all the big four, but certainly for the majority. And you might go, well, it's just impossible to do that because I would get fired, or I wouldn't get a promotion, or whatever it is, whatever reason it is. If that is true and you have tried other things first, then looking for another employer is a way to go. Some of you, though, who think that I'm being unrealistic with the advice in this episode, some of you will be wrong, and it will be your mindset that thinks it's not possible, and you just need to try some things and hopefully just see for yourself that it is actually possible, whether that's learning the tips given in this episode or whether it's trying something else. I would say there's very few cases overall where you can't get down to the hours that you want to with a certain employer. Yes, there's always exceptions, and some of you will be right that it's just unrealistic and not possible. Fine, look for another employer. You might need to take a pay cut hit, and maybe you're not up for that, or maybe you are and the hours are more important, but whatever it is, if you want to work the hours that you want to work and not more than those, then I suppose you just need to think in the rounds about what you want out of work and if you're happy to take that pay cut or whatever. So yeah, tip number 8 is look for another employer where the hours you want to work are possible if you think, or if it's impossible at the place that you currently work at. In summary then for this episode, so tip 1 is to be upfront and honest whether a deadline is achievable at the point the deadline is suggested. Tip 2 is to make your boundaries clear from day 1. Tip 3 is to purge all pointless, non-essential and unimportant tasks. Tip 4 is schedule time for the important tasks, particularly those that are non-urgent. Tip 5 is think long-term and not always short-term. Tip 6 is aim to be productive and effective when doing work. Tip 7 is delegate and get support from colleagues. And tip 8 is to look for another employer where the hours you want to work are not possible at your current place. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP75. All links mentioned in this episode are within the show notes, including links to the 2 books that I mentioned, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and The One Thing. They include the delegation episodes and also links to my masterclasses. The next tax research masterclass, which is designed to help you develop the practical skills to undertake quality research at work and document your findings, is in September of this year. And the first tax advice masterclass, which is designed to teach you how to provide high quality tax advice that clients can use to make informed decisions easily and develop the trusted advisor relationship with them, that is in July. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe to sign up for email notifications to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you've taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.